Hello and welcome everybody to my video review of the Transformers Studio Series Deluxe Class Jazz. So here we got the figure and package, and we'll kind of show you around while I talk about some general info. So, general info about this figure, like I stated, its Deluxe Class was released in the third quarter of the 2018 year, part of the Wave 2 of the Studio Series line, and the retail price is $19.99 for this guy. Even though online I've seen it vary and fluctuate, sometimes upwards of $29.99 or more. Kind of depends on where you shop. And let's talk about the first impressions that I've had towards this line and this figure. So first impressions are that I'm really torn between liking and disliking the Studio Series packaging. On the one hand, I really do like the overall design aesthetic of the packaging and the collector friendliness that the boxes provide compared to the standard deluxe class blisters that used to be more prevalent in the first movie line. I think that the artwork and graphics on the box are very nice, and overall they tend to not use stock photos so much, and they kind of have some very nice graphics on it. And while that's all nice and everything I mentioned is great, what I don't like is the increased price that this packaging tends to create with the new Studio Series line. Now, I'm not entirely sure if the reason that these new deluxes are so expensive, so much more expensive because of the new packaging, but if that is the case, then I would rather take more blander packaging in exchange for less price any day. Most people in general tend to discard and throw away the boxes after they open their figure anyways, so the fact that these figures have gotten as pricey as they have, even with inflation, kind of borderline makes me want to hold off on buying more figures or collecting less in general, just because these things have gotten so expensive. But regardless of that, I think if we're just looking at it from a design perspective, it's pretty nice. So, moving on, let's get this thing unboxed. Well, before we do that, let's talk about the box for a second. So I kind of touched on this figure and Studio Series not using stock photography for the graphics, but this is one outlier. So if you can take a look here, this photo here, as well as the graphics on the side for Jazz, these are stock photos. For the other figures, they've kind of had their new graphics, newly rendered graphics, but for Jazz, this is a stock photo from the first movie poster and a couple other products I've seen it on. So it's interesting that he doesn't get his own. And this one here, pretty infamous for being used online a lot for Jazz's photos whenever you search for him online. On the back, you've got some nice shots of the product itself. Looks like it was kind of touched up in Photoshop, but regardless, it does look very nice. Some of the co-cells are locked down. Bumblebee, Stinger, and it says it converts in 19 steps here. There's no bio or stats. I miss back in the day when the Transformers used to come with a quick bio of the character and would also give you an overall rundown of their intelligence, speed, endurance, and those types of things, but we're not getting that here, so it's kind of a shame. But with that said, let's get this figure unboxed and we'll take a look at the vehicle mode. So here's Jazz in his vehicle mode, and first impressions, I gotta say, it's a very nice alt mode. The paint job on it's very premium. It's covered from front to back in a very nice silver paint. Hasbro these days doesn't seem to dish this paint out as much as they used to, but when they do, it does come out very nicely. But speaking of that silver paint, there are cons to it as well, and I'll point one out right now. So I'll move this in close so you guys can see what I'm talking about. I can get this to focus there. So you can see here, the silver paint, while as nice as it is, can have some downsides to it, and the one major downside is abrasions. So if you look at the left-hand side of my side view mirror on this Jazz, you'll notice that there is a bit of paint scrape here, and that's just naturally going to happen over time as you transform this thing back and forth, or if you have an occasional drop or just scrape it against something on your desk. The more and more those silver paints get peeled off layer by layer, the more the undercoat is going to show. So if it was cast in silver plastic, for example, that wouldn't be an issue, but because it's paint, you have to be more careful with it, especially when you are dealing with something that transforms back and forth. You're going to have a lot of friction. Tying into that, if you look at the window section here, any clear component really, so the headlights, the windshield and the side windows, they're clear, and that's because this whole component and these components here are actually clear plastic that's been cast and then painted over in silver, which makes me wonder if you have those abrasion issues that was on the side view mirror on these components here, if over time it's going to cause the paint to kind of dissipate and reveal that clear plastic. So I'm not sure long term how this figure will be affected by that, especially on the secondhand market once, a few years down the line when these things are no longer available from retailers and you buy it secondhand, if that's going to be an issue. So it's just something to consider. Next, let's do a side-by-side comparison of this figure with the real car. So I'll get an image pulled up here. So you can see to the left, it's a Pontiac Solstice render. So this is the car that that Jazz was based off of, and you can see that the proportions and overall aesthetic are done very nicely with this figure. All of the main components have been modeled and molded, and it's very faithful to the real car. The real car, the Pontiac Solstice, it's actually no longer in production. The company went bankrupt shortly after the movie was released, so it's kind of funny that the movie ended up promoting a car that actually doesn't exist anymore, and I think shortly afterwards you couldn't even buy the car after the movie came out, so kind of ironic there. It's actually one of the last cars that was produced by Pontiac, but enough rambling about that. Let's just take a look at the cars and talk about some of the details they were able to recreate. So if you look to the right, they got the red Pontiac logo there. Very nice job molding that. There's no ink spillage with that. Underneath in the grille, you've got the two black sections here, as well as the fog lights that have been molded and painted very well. No major paint bleeds. I know that used to be an issue with some figures. The headlights and the windshields, like I stated, very nicely done, even though it is clear plastic that's been painted with silver. There's no bleed over, and there's no issue with the crispness of the lines. One thing I noticed, I'm not sure if Jazz in the movie had these hubcaps painted in silver. According to the picture, it does look like it, but I'm not entirely sure. Still not the end of the world, still does look good with the hubcaps there. And the only other issue I had was that little minor scrape with the right side rear view mirror, but hey, what are you going to do? Not the end of the world. Overall, very nice with the paneling, not too much. I know some people was definitely having some issues with this figure not tabbing up properly, and really the reason they're having that issue is because they're not, I think most people are forgetting that there's a tab on the roof of this car here, a circular tab that tabs into the midsection underneath the vehicle there. So if you tab everything properly in here, everything will sit very flush, and you still do have some seam lines overall, but I think it's still really well done and very well rendered. Taking a look at the back, you can do a rearward comparison with the vehicle, and it's rendered very well from this angle as well. As you can see, this one is a convertible variant in the image, so it's not 100%, but all of the major angles are very well done. This vent on the side here, painted in very nicely, again with the seam lines. Still not too bad, especially if you're looking at it from far away, you can't really tell. Would have been nice to have a little license plate decal there or something, but still not too bad. And then the brake lights are just silver. Would have been nice to see a little bit of red there, but still very nicely done. Back window, if I can see, it's not, is it transparent? Let me take a look at that. Yeah, that's actually transparent. So this section back here is also clear. And again, with the casting and the painting, no issues with scrapes or spillover, so very nicely done. So this next topic is what makes this figure very controversial these days. Everything from message boards to other reviewers kind of points this topic out. And let's talk about the sense of scale that this figure has compared to other figures in this range. So we're taking a look at the Voyager class Brawl here, and the Deluxe class Lockdown, and of course this is the Deluxe class Jazz. So as you can see, he is pretty small. Now, a lot of people on the internet have been having issues with this, mostly with the price that you're paying for this guy. You're essentially paying 2012 Voyager level prices for a Deluxe that's essentially the size of a Scout class almost. Some people say Legends class, but I think that's exaggerating a little bit. But he definitely is on the small side, especially when you consider that, that's a Deluxe in the same line compared to this guy. Now, I know people have issues with that, but I believe the designers are doing this intentionally. I know that the Studio Series overall is pushing for a better sense of scale among the figures in the line. It's not going to be 100%, but they're trying to basically get what the characters would be in size in the films translated to figures, and have that vary across the different releases that they're doing. I personally don't have an issue with this. I don't think the size is, a problem for me. I will agree it is very small, but I kind of like it. I like the smaller size, less space on the shelf, but I can understand why it would make some people upset too. So it's kind of a very debatable topic there. Despite that, even though that they say that the Studio Series figures are designed to kind of be in scale with each other, this Pontiac Solstice compared to this Lockdown figure, which is a Lamborghini Aventador, these are not quite the same size. They would be very similar in size. The Aventador is actually a pretty small car too. I'm not a car guy by any means, but looking at pictures, I don't think that's 100%, so not sure what the designer's argument for that is to back it up, but that kind of gives you a sense of the scale. So here's Jazz all transformed up in his robot mode. And I'm not quite sure what it is, but this mode just really works for me. I'm a big fan of it. I'm not sure if it's the proportions or the coloring or what, but I don't know. As far as the Studio Series figures go, this has got to be one of my favorite ones. It's got loads of great details, pretty faithful to the on-screen counterpart. And we'll do a comparison in a second. We'll just give you guys some overall angles of the figure. Just kind of like the side silhouette there. There's also a pretty big debatable issue here with the backpack. Kind of takes up a majority of the backside of the figure, and I really did wish it would compress a little bit better. A lot of people have been talking about the Studio Series Deluxes, namely this one and Lockdown, having pretty notable backpacks, and unfortunately it's no exception. The back bumper does fold in and compresses a little bit, but this whole thing is just hanging back here. I wish it could have maybe folded in half one more time or compressed a little bit better, but what are you going to do? It is what it is. Still looks pretty great, and really most people are never going to display their figures from this side anyway. Looks like I forgot to take down one of these foot pegs here. It's got some heel spurs to stabilize the figure. Complete that 360 and just give you an overall look of it. It's a really, really nice figure. So let's do a side-by-side comparison of the 3D render now. So looking at the CGI model, you'll notice that for a deluxe class figure of this scale, it did a pretty good job. Obviously they're going to be limited with the paint and the budget and what they can do at this size, but for what they have going for it, it's pretty faithful to the on-screen counterpart. You see that the chest compresses very nicely here. Got the bumper and grille that kind of tucks in with the inverted Pontiac logo. Overall, from the top side here, not bad, but there is some details that are molded that aren't picked out, namely the collarbone sections on the CG render that are here. They're molded in, the silver sections. They're molded there, but they're not painted, so that's kind of a shame, but nothing you couldn't do yourself with a little bit of enamel paint and a brush, I think. Very nice head sculpt. We'll take a closer look at that in a second, but this guy has got the visor down. The on-screen render to the left, it's got the visor up, but this figure does have the visor molded in place. Going around to the lower section, the crotch area and the chest, very nice molded detailing. Missing some of the gold paint applications there, but you could pick it out yourself if you're someone who likes to customize. Doesn't detract too much though. The thighs, molded in gray here, silver in the render, but doesn't detract again. And then downwards, overall, very nice detailing. As you can see, these sections are molded in silver plastic when the car sections that are exposed on the outside are painted in silver plastic. One thing I'm not a fan of are the hands. Not so much the design, but I like this four-pronged look that this hand has, while this hand, on the other hand, has this hole, and it kind of leaves the hand looking like a Lego hand, kind of, in that C shape, and that's just to accommodate the accessory we'll take a look at in a second. But I wish they would have either consistently kept the four-pronged hand or this hand. This way it kind of just looks mismatched. I wish they were both four-pronged and they could have integrated the accessory in a different way, but still not that big of a deal. Just something that I'm a little bit nitpicky about. Overall though, the way that the parts configure into robot mode from the CG render from the toy are very similar. So the tires end up on the foot of the figure, on the heels, and they are also up on the shoulders. So I think this is probably the most accurate Jazz figure we've had to date. The Human Alliance one was a great figure, but in terms of accuracy, this one is, I think, winning. So that's kind of the comparison there. And next we'll take a closer look at the head sculpt. Getting up close and personal, you can see just how nice of a head sculpt this figure has. It's cast in two-tone plastic. We've got the gray, the silver paint, and then a clear visor for the head. So very, very nicely distinguished, multiple layered head there. And if you look underneath the visor, you can see the molded detail of his face. Very, very cool. Getting the on-screen counterpart side by side, you can see just how accurate that is. It does have a little bit of a detail on the forehead for the Autobot logo, but it's not picked out in paint. But at this scale, I wouldn't expect that. So nicely done with what they have. Talking about those collarbone sections again, you can see here and here they are molded. They're just not painted. Very easy fix if you were to touch it up, but again, I wish they would have picked that out. For size comparison, here we have his Wave 2 counterpart, Deluxe Class Lockdown, transformed in robot mode, just for a quick scale comparison. I apologize, I just recently moved, so a lot of my stuff is still in storage. I would have done more comparisons, but this is kind of the only thing I have readily available at the moment. And again, you can see the main point of contention is just the sizing. So considering these two are at the same price point and in the same series, you can really see how much more mass Lockdown has compared to Jazz and how much height he has over Jazz. Again, same price point, and this Lockdown is doing a hunched pose compared to Jazz, who is standing straight up. It is accurate, apparently, comparing by scale's sake. These two characters weren't in the same movie, but if they were, I think the height is, not perfect, but Lockdown would be taller than Jazz, so it makes sense that he is. For those who want to bank for their buck, again, I totally understand why they might be upset at the sizing that they went with, but it is what it is. I actually wouldn't be surprised if a third party ended up doing a KO version, a knockoff version of this Jazz, taking the same mold and upsizing it. I could see that selling really well. Not that I advocate that kind of thing, but I wouldn't be surprised if it happened. So there he is, and for size comparison, and we'll take a look at the side profiles. Talking about the backpacks the Studio Series seems to be pushing for. They both have a pretty notable one, and there's that back profile. A lot of complexity in the transformation, not too much, but for some reason when it comes to kibble, it always ends up folding up into a section on the back. Not the worst I've seen, not the best either. And again, most people will display these things from the front, so they both look great from that angle. And that does it for the size comparison. Taking a look at his accessories, the only one he comes with is his pretty distinctive shield gun from the first film. As you can see, it's got the turrets in the front painted in a very nice gold, and the rest of the weapon is cast in silver plastic. No silver paint for that. It turns out when I was talking about wishing about this thing integrating into the arm better, it actually does give you the option of either hooking it in to the hand directly, if you can make that out, there, with that connection, or holding it in a hand with this circular connection. So it turns out they totally could have made both hands the four-pronged kind of movie design, but they opted to go for one hand with the prongs and one hand having the circular design. But hey, I'm not the designer, I'm just a fan. We'll put this side by side with the movie render now so you can see for accuracy's sake. They did a pretty good job. Again, the movie design seems more metallic in nature. and it would have been nicer to have that silver paint also on this thing, but still looks pretty good for what it is. The one thing that I don't like is storage. I mean, it's not, I wouldn't really know what else they could do with this thing, but in vehicle mode, this weapon kind of just mounts on top and it looks a little silly, but I just end up keeping it off. And that's the only accessories that Jazz comes with, so now we'll move into my final thoughts. So, my closing thoughts on this guy, I really do dig it a lot. The robot mode won me over. From initial pictures, I didn't think I was going to be a fan. I was really never that big of a fan of Jazz in the first movie that much. But when I got it in hand and messed around with it, I'm like, this has got some pretty nice engineering quirks to it, and it's not too complicated, but not too simple either. The robot mode looks good, and despite the few flaws that it has more going for it than it does detriments. Paint is good overall. The size doesn't bother me too much. I do like smaller figures, so that's not a con for me. Price point, that's the only thing I can really think of that I have a gripe towards, and it's not just him, it's just figures in general. The prices that these things go for, I don't understand how. I mean, I'm an adult, so I can afford these things, but kids, they're going to have a harder time convincing their parents to get these things for them. So we'll just see how that kind of affects Hasbro and Takara in the long run, but that's out of my control. As a figure, though, it's great. I think most fans will get what they want out of this thing. And, I think by now, if you don't like this thing, you've already made up your mind. But as far as for me, solid, would recommend. If I had to give it a rating out of 5, probably sits at a 4.2 for me overall. So that concludes my review of the Studio Series Deluxe Class Autobot Jazz. I'd love to, answer any questions you guys might have, or just start a discussion about the Studio Series line or Transformers in general in the comments. And I look forward to making another video soon. So yeah, I'll talk to you guys later.